Lord Arnold first left his sister to go off to meet the public. He who had been educated after his parents had died when he was very young. Been educated then not in the ways of the world, but according to that romance and whimsy his guardians thought fitting. He a man then who knew more Coleridge and even Mrs. Radcliffe than Kant or mathematics, who knew more about the history of Greece than he did the history of England, who cared more for rocks and old castles than ever he did for modern roads and rail. When then Lord Arnold, the Earl of Wiltshire, since he was 3, came to London in almost the first public meeting, he saw him. Duke Beyer, he was called. Lord Beyer, he insisted. Duke of Epirus. A nobleman recently come to Great Britain from some far southern foreign clime, for his skin was olive, his face smooth, as if it never grew hair, apart from the hair on his head that could have been painted on. It was so lacquered down and so smooth, with an immaculate hat and tie pin. He looked and sounded, albeit with an ever such a slight lisp on his voice, every inch the noble, every inch the Englishman. And so the Lord Beyer was welcomed to all the soirees and all the withdrawing rooms, all the parties that Arnold went to. And Arnold would sit and look at the handsome, cold face of Lord Beyer and wonder at it, and many men did. For although Beyer was thought by the ladies beyond handsome, and the most wanton would throw themselves at her, such was his iron virtue, that although Lady Charlotte herself, she the Princess of Scandal, tried to seduce him, he simply left her cold. And when he left her, she said afterwards to her select circle, it was a shiver. You know you can't read his face, but this was something more. It was like the man had no soul of his own, if you know what I mean. As if his face was just a mask with nothing on the inside. Be that as it may, it was known that Lord Beyer must be a virtuous man. Certainly, he would see often the women who were famous for their virtue and their honour. To them, he was every inch the interested mentor, and soon was well trusted by the guardians to form part of their education. A lord who had seen so many ways in Europe and who could be trusted. When he saw that, Arnold thought of a scheme of his own, for here was a man of his own heart, more worldly than him, but just as virtuous, and given also over, women said, and men, to dreaming, for he could tell tales of far-off times, of the wars against the Turk, of the struggles against the Slav, by which they were brought to Christianity by the sword, days then long gone. But he could tell them as if he had been there. And that was the only time Lord Beyer's eyes would glint. Here then, thought Arnold, his own heart. And he declared his intention to go on what he had not gone on before, a grand progress, by which the young are initiated into the ways of the old and become as experienced in the ways of virtue, but more often vice, as their elders. And Arnold asked in public whether anybody would accompany him, and there was a stab that jumped in his heart when Lord Bayer said he would, that he would be delighted to go, that he wished to go abroad himself, to go back and visit those lands he once knew so well. He would go. And so it was, the two of them took the boat from Calais. Although, to be truthful, Arnold didn't know whether Bayer was on the boat or not until they arrived at Calais. For Bayer seemed to be seasick and hidden in his cabin. But when the boat docked, Arnold got out of the boat and the Lord greeted him on the quay as if he'd been already there. And the two went through Paris and made their way slowly to Turin and Milan and down at last to Rome. Now, although he studied the character of Lord Bayer long, Lord Arnold could not say he learnt anything from the study. He merely learnt more from Bayer's effect on all those they met. For on the face of it, Lord Bayer seemed to be magnificent in his generosity. There was very few beggars he would not give gold to. There were very few women of the night he would not pay. There was almost no ruined house on some broken old nobleman who, when he heard, he would help. And yet they would hear, following them like a rumour, like a distant flame, that every time Lord Bayer helped someone, every time he gave it to a beggar, that beggar proved to be a thief and was sure to be hung. That every time he helped a nobleman, that nobleman was a gambler and would spend the gold and others he didn't have upon tables and mortgage his wife and his children for his gain. And all the women on the streets he gave money to were as sure as not found dead soon after. And unreluctantly, Arnold began to come to the conclusion there was something about Lord Bayer, for all this seemed to be no impact on him. Like the fact that Lord Bayer would often sit late at the gaming tables and always seemed to win, although none could see if he cheated. Indeed, the only time he ever lost was as some sort of bait to take some gambler who had been addicted to the sport and trick him, to make him bet his all against Bayer, and then Bayer would win his gold. And so it was, the news of all this followed them. And for a long time Arnold tried to outdistance it, wondering what it was about the Lord Bayer, because he was sure it was nothing in the Lord's nature. You could see it. For that Lord had a frozen face, a little olive complexion, but somehow ageless. He looked so innocent, save his teeth were a little sharp, and his eyes sometimes a little hollow, and nobody could read what expression he pulled. But when at last they came to Rome, Lord Arnold thought that he really would have to tell Bayer and ask him about the ruin they seemed to be causing. And indeed, Lord Bayer seemed to be wooing again another woman, the daughter of his landlord, for the two stayed apart in the Vatican. Bayer stayed inside the Vatican City. under the precept of Rome. But Arnold was forever scrambling over the ruins, going down to far off Ostia, going around the ancient walls, the Aurelian walls, thinking of the action and the history they have seen. But all the time he thought, he wondered about having a word with Bea, telling him to desist, asking him what was the meaning and why this happened. But when they met, Bea's eye was always so innocent, it seemed to him. He could not open his mouth. But it was one day he got 2 letters from England. The first was his younger sister Sophia, full of love, asking him to describe fully what he had seen. But the other was from his guardian, telling him that it had been revealed that Lord Bea was a man of bad character. For all the virtuous women he had talked to, all those he had educated so well, it seemed, in England, were now but broken reeds who had overthrown the virtues of their hearts and become wicked. And when asked, all they would say was that his face swam before them at the night and had taught them what to do. And so they begged Lord Arnold to flee him. Well, Arnold needed no encouragement. He announced abruptly that he was going to go to Greece, and Bea said, "Well, I shall stay here, for I have business yet undone. I shall see you in Greece, one way or t'other, my friend, one way or t'other." Not likely, thought Arnold, and gave him false addresses. And then he took the boat across and went down to far off Sparta, thinking it distant enough and wild enough that Lord Bea, who loved not ruins but loved cities, would not follow him. And he stayed then with a Greek minor noble family who only had a daughter, Irene, and lived in the ruins of old Sparta. And then Arnold entered a blissful time, for he and Irene would travel from ruin to ruin, and while she looked at butterflies as like as not, or sometimes read old books, and once in a while seemed to be peering under stones, as if she might have been looking for something lost. He studied the stones and looked at the inscriptions and marvelled at the ancient prowess of the rocks. They travelled together to Mycenae and to Tiryns and even to sandy Pylos, and always it was the same. Irene was either gathering butterflies or looking under rocks, and smiled and laughed. When Arnold whispered with delight, seeing some Greek inscription upon the stones, or read her from wise Homer what had happened here. And so they carried on for 2 months, and Arnold felt he might love Irene, and wondered whether this would be the moment to talk of his intentions. But somehow he put it off, for he laughed. He can't come back with a bride, he thought, thinking of his guardians. He, the Earl of Wiltshire, marry a Greek woman of minor house? It couldn't be done. Could it? Could it? He loved her deeply, or so he thought. To clear his mind, he determined to ride across the mountains that were full of rock and wood, to ruins that men said were there upon the far-off plain, ruins he had never seen. As chance would have it, Irene was locked in her room when he made his intentions plain, and wouldn't come down at all. More secretive she had been of late, ever since they had gone to Pylos, and he had heard her cry, as a cry of victory, as a cry of someone who had found something they had long sought when scrambling in the rocks. And he could have sworn she carried something under her skirt, long and thin, but she kept it secret. And now when he announced his intention to go, she said she would not go. But her parents came to him and begged him not to go. For they said, "Do you not know? Those mountains and those woods are home of the Voodalac." "The what?" said Lord Arnold. "The Voodalac. You might call it a vampire." "Why, this land was once held by a famous duke. The Duke of Epirus he was. He ruled it in the days of our grandfathers. Held it with an iron hand. Held it for 200 years or more, until his power was broken by the Turk. And then he fled, and some say he travels still the courts of Venice and of Vienna. I remember my father claimed once to have seen him, once as a boy, but once as an old man, when he was at the Venetian carnival. And he said his olive skin was just the same. His cold stare had not changed. So said Irene's father in earnest. "I do not believe that," said Duke Arnold. "You must," said the mother. "You must, for do you not know those who deny the vampire will have their hearts broken by them. It is the charm." And Arnold took a step back, for just at that moment he thought of the Duke of Epirus. He knew, but he shook his head and said, "No. No, I do not believe you. What does Irene say?" And Irene looked down from her room and said, "I say only this, that vampires can be slain. Is that not what the works tell us? An ancient blade will do it." And her father looked up to her and said, "You know that is not true. The word the poet uses is not slain, merely made to pass over." "Well, that is good enough for me," said Irene, and went back to her room. Well, Duke Arnold rode out, and he rode over the wooded mountains and into the distant plain. And there indeed was a true ruined city, maybe the ruins of true Sparta. Glorious it seemed to him. He saw beyond the ruins to the great city of Menelaus. He read then the holy words of Homer. He looked to the citadel of Helen and seemed to find it there. He went into her bedroom and dreamed, while the sun started to wester, and out from the distant east storm clouds blew. Now he had, before he had left, such had been their fear, assured his host that he would be home before sunset. For as the woman, his host's wife, has rightly said, the vampire is at power at night. That is when they suck the blood. By that blood they are made young and whole and fresh. If you come back before the nightfall, you will be safe, and we will all be safe. And indeed it had been their last words to him. Well, Irene, she had sent down a little crucifix with a note on it. "Go with my love and wear this. Do not take it off. Irene." He had laughed then, but now as he stayed too long, as the clouds and storms started to build, as the night started to set, the night of a hot sun of the south, where there is no twilight, where you go 1 minute from heat to the next to dark, he suddenly had a jolt of fear. The horse no doubt knew the way home, and he guided it then over the hills and mountains and through the wood. And as they reached the wood, suddenly the storm broke with wild thunder, and his horse galloped and galloped off into the forest, far into the forest, and he could barely control it as it wildly neighed and started. How far he went he was never quite sure, but at last He was right in the centre of the forest when suddenly it stopped and would go no more. And then he heard a cry, such a terrible cry. A man and a woman's voice seemed blended in it, and both cried with victory, and both cried with terror. And he looked and he saw there was a little hovel, and in that hovel there was something akin to a light being held up. And he ran to it, and he opened the door. But him opening the door set up a draught, and the light, which was a candle, suddenly went out. And there was a terrible noise, for the voices sounded again, but now the woman screamed, and the man roared with delight. And he stretched out to meet them, but he could not find them. The hovel must be bigger than he thought. He stumbled in the dark. Suddenly there was something on him, some dark figure, clutching for something, some weapon, and was gone. He could feel only he could smell only a smell as it passed, of old death and blood, quite fresh. And he looked around in the dark and wondered what he would do. He sat there as a man broken, reaching out on either side, but he could not feel another body. Nothing. How long he was there, he was never sure. But when the storm stopped, there came the sound of voices outside. Many torches were coming, as if they were looking for someone, and they were led by his host. And his host called out, "Irene! Irene, are you there?" And no voice came in reply. But Duke Arnold replied, "I am here at least." And they came up, and they opened the door, and shone their lanterns in. And the Duke was alone. So the Earl, Arnold, was alone. But with him was a corpse, a woman. It was Irene. And in her hand she held a dagger that she had clearly drawn from some missing scabbard, for so sharp it was. And Arnold looked at it and saw written on it was a name, Bea, I am for he, in Greek, in strange faded letters, and he wondered at it. But he was wet and tired and exhausted. Past exhaustion, he collapsed himself in black fever. And they took him then back to their home. And while they mourned their daughter with all their heart and mind, and would not tell him how she got into the forest, whether the creature, clearly a vampire, for she had no blood in her body, had taken her from their home, or whether she had hunted it down in the forest and somehow been betrayed, they would say nothing. Only the mother once said, "Why did she not keep her holy candle bright? Why not? She must do the deed. Why not?" When he asked them whether the dagger was theirs, they shook their heads and shivered and said, "No, you must take it with you. It is now for you. Its name is on it." All this they said to him before the black fever struck. But as the fever mounted, he was full of the darkest dreams, the most twisted of thoughts, and always in those thoughts he saw Lord Bea swim before him, his face, his smile, impenetrable. But in the dream, a single drop of blood flowed from Bea's lips. Well, as it happened, the Count, who he was staying with, the minor Greek nobles, had a guest staying with them in the latter part of Lord Arnold's illness. And as Arnold could not ask for more money from his far-off guardians, It was the guest who paid not just for his own lodging, but Arnold's. It was the guest then that fed him the finest foods. It was the guest then that read him those romances that he loved so well, then made him feel at home. And struggling awake, the first face he saw with his sane and waking eyes was Lord Bayard, looking at him with such benevolent kindness. He shivered and wondered at what he had dreamed and what he had seen. But Bayard, who had arrived and nursed him long, looked after him well. And Arnold wondered at it and wondered what it meant and why. And while he was too weak to think, he had already agreed with Lord Bayard that they would travel now through Greece, that they would visit all the sites in the Acropolis and the Necropolis and anywhere else he wanted to go. And Bayard said, I shall look after you like the man I am. And it was true, Arnold left as soon as he could, perhaps before his health was quite good. And the pair of them travelled around for all of the Peloponnese and then up through Athens to Euboea, coming at last to Thessaly. And there, as if they were travelling in the days of the Golden Ass, they heard endless tales of robbers, and people would volunteer to help them, to look after them. Little more robbers themselves, Arnold thought. And he would always refuse their help. And Bayard would smile and said, quite wise, quite wise. But one day they were on their way to Meteora, and riding through the great chasms of the mountains, when suddenly, from the rocks, robbers came and attacked them fiercely after their gold. A robber shot through the heart Lord Bayard, and he fell as if dead. And then Arnold sued for peace and mercy, and promised no vengeance if they would just nurse him and his friend. He gave them what gold he had and promised them more. And then two robbers, as they would, suddenly changed hands, realising it was more lucrative to save these lives than slay them, and he drove off the other robbers. And they took Bayard, who seemed to be still alive, if just, only just, and Lord Arnold to a little cave, and there they nursed them. And Bayard was alive enough. And he turned to Arnold and said, whatever happens, on that life I nursed of yours, on that black fever I once cured, in its name I wish you to do me a favour. And Arnold said, what? I would do anything for you, anything to make you live, for the pity of Bayard's death felt somehow too deep for him to handle. There, in the far-off Greek lands, this the man he'd once mistrusted, who now had turned out to be his friend, who had nursed him when all others had left him. What is it? Said Lord Arnold. Only this, that whatever happens, you swear now an oath on the life of your sister, on your very soul, not to speak it for a year and a day, not to speak of me. And what happened? Such is the infamy of my end. You must not speak of it. I cannot have peace. I cannot die, knowing that I will be the laughter of England when you tell them that I was killed by Greek robbers. And so Edward Arnold swore upon the life of his sister, upon the very sanity of his soul, that he would not speak of the fate of Lord Bayard for a year and a day. And he swore it on the Holy Bible, and he swore it on Bayard's life and death. And Bayard said, go find a doctor, if you can. And so Edward Arnold rode off, coming to Meteora, and came back the next day with a doctor and a papa. But they came back to the cave, and Lord Bayard was gone. And Arnold asked and said, where is he? And the robber said, we did not do away with him. We have not sold him. No, he insisted, even as that when he was dead, as the new moon rose last night, we put him on the mountains and let the moonlight do the rest. And Arnold went to look up on the mountains at that sight they showed him, and there was nothing there. I say nothing. There was one thing. There was a shoe. To prove that Baya had been there, for the shoe was Baya's. But his body was gone, quite gone. And Arnold wondered at it. But he had enough of travelling, so he decided to go home. So he made arrangements as fast as he could. He took the ferry from Brindisi. He went back to Rome. He asked in trepidation what had happened to the woman that Lord Baya had been courting, and discovered that she too had been murdered, found lifeless, without blood or soul. And then at last, full of fear, trying to make sense of it all, Lord Arnold came back to England and went to his home in Amesbury, and there kissed his sister, and she had grown tall and beautiful and loving. And they laughed in the joy of his homecoming, and they were full of schemes. Most pressing, it seemed to him, that she should come out, for she was nearly 19 and utterly lovely, a beautiful soul, so well meant and made. And so it was, they pressed their guardians to allow her to come out to the next drawing room, which was near at hand, to meet the king and queen. And so it was, she and Arnold went, and there was such a press of people, such a pomp and such a majesty, such a beauty, that Arnold felt content for the very first time since he'd come to England, truly content, as if he was doing the right thing. And he looked round the room, thinking that it was in this room that he'd first met Lord Baya. And as he looked, suddenly he took a step back. A handsome man put his finger to his lips. It was Baya, changed a little, if anything younger, more healthy, with teeth flashing white. And he was now known by a different name, a French pseudonym, but the same. And as Lord Baya put his finger momentarily to his lips, Lord Arnold heard in his ear, "You must keep your oath." And even as he tried to say Baya's name, his tongue stung, clove to his mouth, and would not move, and no sound would come out of it. And he shivered. And the pair, his sister and he, left. And he turned to his sister and said, "There's one there you must never talk to." And she said, "Who?" But Arnold could not say the name, either the name, the alias under which Lord Baya was, or his own name. Nothing at all. Nothing. And he went back to the stuff he had brought back from his journey, and he realised not all of it was his own. On the contrary, there was some of Lord Baya's stuff there. Strange it was. Collections of jewels, pictures of women long dead, treasures from previous ages, and a collection of weapons, and each on them written the same word, "I am for Baya." Suddenly he saw that amongst this collection there was a scabbard that was the match, he thought, for the sword Irene had had, as if Baya had snatched the scabbard when she had drawn the blade. And he fitted them in, they fitted exactly. And he remembered her words, that vampires could be slain if only he could find the sword. And he wondered what to do. But then he thought of the finger on the lips, and a voice whispered in his ear, "You must keep your oath." Well, his sister Sophie was for going out now to balls, and they went often to balls. But it was the second great ball, the royal ball, to be her most splendid when she had her diamonds on her. And they were dancing around, where he saw the same figure, Lord Baya, standing in the shadows, looking at his sister, eyes full of lust or love or whatever, face inscrutable as ever, licking his lips. When he saw that, Lord Arnold hurried his sister out of the ball, although it was not the time, although she protested, although she cried it was not fair, and could not tell her. He could not tell her why. He merely said to her, I cannot tell you the reason. All I can say is this. Do not go into society this year. Wait for next, for then I can give you the wisest of counsels. But Sophie said, no, this is my year. You only come out the once. And when he heard that, Lord Arnold's proud spirit broke, and the black fever returned to haunt him. It racked his dreams and seemed to prey upon his sanity, so that he would go out at night as some dark figure haunting the lands, and men wondered at it, and they sent for his guardians, and they came and they took him back to Wiltshire, and there he stayed, railing, and sometimes he would take out a sword and twist it around his head, but as he was not suicidal, they let him do it, and often he would cry and cry, Lord, but, as if he would denounce someone, but then he would listen, and it would be like something shut him up. But his guardians noticed that he was always counting the days, that he kept a steady record of them there upon the wall. And as the days went by, he seemed to get happier, seemed to get saner. And he had been back in England nearly a year now, when they heard word that he was sane at last, or next to sane. And so they went to see him, and there he was, eating a hearty breakfast, and said he was sorry about it, and it was passing, and he was sure that it would be all right, but could he see Sophie? And they said, of course you can. She's getting married tomorrow, but you can see her today. She's coming back. Married who to? Arnold asked. Oh, she's marrying the Duke of Hastings. Now, Arnold rubbed his chin. He remembered the Duke of Hastings, a likely enough chap, a young man. He had known him as a boy. Yes, that was a fitting husband for his sister, and he tilted his hat and said, wonderful, wonderful, all things wonderful. And so it was when Sophie came in, she was taken to her brother, and she greeted him with a warmth and a love they hadn't shown each other throughout his illness, for he would scream and sob when he saw her when he had been ill. And she revelled in delight to have him sane, and said, you should come to my wedding. And she looked then at a locket that she held over her heart, and her brother playfully picked it open. And there a miniature of Bayer's heartless face stared out. Who's that? Said Lord Arnold. Oh, that's the Duke of Hastings. But I thought the Duke of Hastings was a young man. Oh, you're thinking about the old one. He died beginning of the year, and as the see went vacant, as the dukeship was vacant, and my current husband, the new Lord Bayer, was due to go on a foreign mission, the king gave him the title. This is the man I shall marry tomorrow. Arnold took a step back in horror. He could feel the black madness rise again. He tried to speak, but again in his ear he seemed to hear, you must keep your oath and be silent. Silent upon your life, upon your sister's life, upon the sanity of your soul. He shivered and said, only this. I cannot explain why, Sophie, but if you must marry this man, have this as your gift, my wedding gift. And he took then the dagger, and he said, at the time, when the time is right, you will know to use it. Just carry it with you in your skirts. It will hide quite well. And Sophie looked at him with pity, and it was true, he started to scream and to rave. And she left him, but she took the dagger. Well, the next day was her wedding day, and he raved and he raved and he screamed while all outside was joy. and they couldn't put him in a room far enough, and the guests would listen to his raving and his calling, and only he who had been Lord Bayer seemed to smile, as if there was a humour in the mocking. It was a year and nearly a day since Lord Bayer had lived and died. Well, Bayer and his bride rode off, for he, it was said, had an embassy in Europe, in Vienna, and he was going to go there with his new bride. Well, upon that night, when the year and the day had lapsed, Arnold sent for his guardians, and they came before him, and he was like a broken man, a man already dead and dying. For the madness and the fever had racked his body to the point of breaking, but he told them about Bayer. He told them what he knew. He told them how he had lived and died and lived again, coming back as someone else. And it was like for them, the shadow lifted from their eyes, and they saw Bayer for what he was. And leaving Arnold in the hands of a priest, they rode out, meaning to catch up the carriage of Bayer. But Bayer drove, it was said, with the whips of the devil, and had already crossed the boat to Calais. And following him, the guardians came, and they rode down from Calais down towards Paris. And often they heard the rumour that the two were just ahead of them. And on the eve of the third day of the chase, they turned a corner, and there was a carriage they knew was Bayer's. And coming up upon it, they saw Bayer dead, and in his heart there was the dagger. I am meant for Bayer on its blade. But of Sophie there was nothing. No word was ever heard from her. No one saw her who knew her for who she was. Only a rumour that a woman had arrived in the embassy in Vienna, who was cold and heartless, but utterly lovely, and seemed to stay there for many years, ageless. Sophia, she said she was called, and for all saying she was German, she had an English accent. And Arnold died, and men wondered whether the vampire had passed on or passed over.